Berkeley and was a postdoc at UC Santa Cruz doing a tour of the UC system. And she's currently the science director for Save for Redwood. So I imagine many of you have interacted with Emily at some point or another. She will be talking about western sword ferns and the extreme recent drought.
Well, coming up here, I had to stop taking notes because I was madly scribbling down everything that Chris just talked about. I'm so fascinated by these genetic results. It's really fun to be in a session where we're talking about the plants that everybody steps on when they're looking up at the really tall redwoods, but the understory and herbaceous plants are one of the more interesting things that I've found working in the redwood forest, and so I'm excited to talk to you about western sword fern. The western sword fern, as you know, it grows abundantly throughout the coast redwood range. It's a species that has a wide distribution. It grows all the way up the Pacific Northwest. It grows east on North America into the Midwest. Fascinating species. Within the coast redwood range, it's one of those species that we find in every single coast redwood forest. Typically has high ground coverage. And it really can dominate in these fern glades. It can be the dominant species where you don't find other plants growing when it gets a strong foothold. And this is an example of that bottom tier of the understory really being thick with sword fern, with the shrubs above it and then the redwoods, of course, overhead. This is a map that gives you no state lines because of our bulb situation. You can check out over there, but you're all familiar with what the coast redwood range looks like in California. Here's a series. This is actually just a subset of the sites where we're doing this project. I've been studying western sword fern for about a decade, and it was in 2006. I was doing my dissertation research, and I was trying to figure out these really complex calculations about fog absorption in the redwood forest and the contribution of the understory layer to absorbing fog. And I remember I was driving up Highway 101 in Mendocino County thinking, if I can't get this fog project to work, what am I going to do? What is this chapter going to be about? And it just hit me. I'd been going to these sites, and in the northern part of the range, the ferns were towering over my head, and when I was working down in the Santa Cruz Mountains, they were just up to my knees. And I thought, well, that's sort of obvious, right? It's a lot wetter up north, but nobody had documented it. Such a striking pattern in the size and the morphology of the species. Why is it so much more abundant up north? Is it actually more abundant, or are the plant individuals just larger? The picture on the right-hand side is a picture taken vertically down from 7 meters above the forest floor that's covered with sword fern. And it's really interesting when you start to look more closely at the pattern of this species on the forest floor. Areas where there's actually no sword fern, you can get patches. And it seems like those might be persistent over time. Why is that? Why don't ferns occupy that spot? They obviously have a good foothold. Really interested in questions like that in the forest. So we set up a series of plots, and at each of these sites we have 10 plots where we've been following the demography and the size of sword fern for a number of years. And I'm going to talk to you about the drought period that we had that started in 2012 and quote unquote ended in 2015, but I think we all know the jury's still out on that. So to just visualize the latitudinal gradient, and now I'm going to show you those same sites, but actually look at the climate space that they occupy. Wow. Okay, so let's go over here. Can't even see it on here. Okay. Well, imagine a shape encompassing all of those points. And what you see is this climate envelope where you have annual mean precipitation on the y-axis, and on the x-axis you have annual total precipitation that comes in. So we already know about our northern coast redwood sites, Prairie Creek, Jedediah Smith. These are the really, really wet, and they're also the coolest sites that we have on average. As you move up this direction, we get into the central part of the range. Montgomery Woods, Humboldt Redwoods, and the Grove of Old Trees is a site in Sonoma County, really similar in terms of annual precipitation and temperature. And then as we get into the more southern sites, they are not only the most dry, but they tend to be the warmest. So it's pretty fascinating that all these species are spanning that huge climatic gradient. So that's an interesting context for us to think about how the drought actually manifested over the last 4 or 5 years. And I'm going to show you the response of sword fern over that time period. Okay, you can kind of see this. This is the percent difference of the precipitation and total annual precipitation that came into all of these sites compared to a 30-year average. So if you assume the last 3 decades on average defines the climate for the region, then if you're below zero, that means you're significantly lower than average, and if you're above the line, then you actually were above average. It's sort of interesting to see what was changing over the period of the drought. So I'm just going to show you precipitation, but what's really notable about the drought we had was that it was a warm drought. We had unprecedentedly high temperatures at the same time that we were having low rainfall. So everyone thinks the drought, we have a Mediterranean climate, all the forests must be getting the same kind of weather, but of course we all know that that's not true. And it was very clear to us that that was true over the last few years. On the x-axis here, we're looking at from north to south the arrangement of these field sites. So Jedediah Smith was actually below average, below the 30-year average in precipitation all 3 years. The worst was really in 2014. Prairie Creek, interestingly, was slightly above average in 2012. You can't see it here, but it's actually up to about this point. And then it gets really bad in 2014. Consistently across all the sites, 2014 had the lowest rainfall. And in 2015, it rebounded in terms of total precipitation. Now, if we slice and dice this a little bit differently and look at the seasons that rainfall was coming in, the rainfall in 2015 was actually coming in the late winter. It came in December. There were a few really large storms that made the total precipitation go up. But that was phenologically out of sync with sword fern and when it's growing. So that, just keep in mind this pattern, thinking about 2014 being the worst year in terms of water deficit. 2015 seems like it recovers, but I put out there maybe it doesn't actually help the sword fern having less of a deficit because of the timing of when that rainfall came in. So here's a picture of one of the sites. This is Humboldt Redwoods along the Damnation Creek Trail. This is one of the places where I didn't put in plots, and I'm really mad that I didn't, but it was one of the places where we saw this very characteristic browning of the sword fern. I got lots of calls from folks. It looks really bad like this in the Mount Tam area in Marin County. People thought, oh, the sword fern's dying. This is horrible. What's going to happen? But this was really characteristic of many places where you saw a lot of fronds that seemed to be dying, and the question was, can sword fern handle this sort of water deficit and these really warm weather patterns that we had had? I'm going to talk to you about the leaf area change, the total leaf area change for the species. But first I'll just explain a little bit about how these data were collected. On the forest floor, we have 3-meter diameter plots, and within that, every individual is tagged. And every year, we go out and do a census where we are checking every plant, seeing if any new recruits have come in, and we're counting all of the living fronds and measuring a subsample of the lengths of the fronds. These data here are a calculation that we've done for each individual plant, and the leaf area is calculated on the number of fronds and the average length of the fronds. So the proportion of the leaf area change relative to the first year of the study, which was 2012. So again, like that rainfall one I showed you, if we're above 0, that means the leaf area was increasing between 2012 and the year in question, so 2013, 2014, or 2015. And down here, we can see the pattern across the sites. So interestingly, with Jedediah Smith, we did see some sort of water deficit progression over the time period, yet they hovered pretty much stayed the same. We saw maybe even a slight increase, growth of the plants over time. But very close by in Prairie Creek, again, a really wet site, cool site in general, we saw a big change. In 2015, the biggest decrease in leaf area relative to the starting condition of 2012. So that was pretty significant. I really can't explain to you why these sites have behaved so differently, but this is pretty striking. If we go down to Humboldt Redwoods, again, a similar pattern except for the fact that even in 2014 we were seeing that reduction in leaf area. At Montgomery Woods, it was variable the first few years, but we did see a decrease. This is a much warmer site than these, so why it didn't have as much of a decrease, don't know. Samuel P. Taylor, this is down in Marin County, really saw a huge decline. We're getting more than 40% reduction in leaf area. Redwood Regional is in the Oakland Hills. Again, very characteristic pattern where it seemed like 2015 was the worst. Big Basin was a really unusual one. It was all over the place. Was there a sampling problem? We're not sure exactly why we're seeing it hop around, and then that was actually higher, like Jedediah Smith in 2015. So this requires more investigation. And then, without a doubt, our Landis Hill, our Big Sur site, had the biggest reduction in leaf area. If we look at what was going on behind these numbers, behind the leaf area, what was it? What was it that changed with these plants to cause that reduction in leaf area? And we can look at the two variables that were combined to calculate leaf area. If we look at the change in the length of the rachis, which is the photosynthetic portion of the blade, we see that across the board, they were getting shorter. Those fronds were shrinking. The pattern is really consistent across all of the sites, and it tends to track with the graph we just looked at. The sites that had the worst reductions in leaf area were definitely having this shrinking of the fern fronds. The other factor was the leaf number, and in some cases the number of fronds per crown was going up, and in some cases it was going down. So sites seem to be having a site-specific response in how they're growing their leaves. Sword fern puts out a cohort of leaves in the spring, and then they're there for about 2.5 years. So it's a perennial species. These are evergreen leaves. But each year, the cohort that the plant puts out must reflect conditions. We don't know what conditions trigger the leaf set. Is that pre-programmed in the plant a year before, and the fern fiddlehead primordia are sitting there waiting, or does it actually respond to the winter conditions before those fronds unfurl? And that's a question that we don't have an answer to. Another factor that was going on over the course of the study is that we were seeing the timing of the fiddleheads, and when they were coming out, they were affected by any heat waves that came through. The leaves are really vulnerable when they're first unfurling, and if they get blasted by a heat wave, we saw aborted fiddleheads that never reached their full length. We also have seen a lot of herbivory from a sawfly. I'm not an entomologist. I would love to get an entomologist working on this project. We've been seeing these fiddleheads being eaten by the sawfly larva. They crawl through the curled up fronds, and then when the frond unfurls, it's deformed and it's lost leaf area, sometimes losing the whole tip of the frond. So some of the shrinking in leaf area may be because of that insect that's affecting it. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the context for this project and encouraging you to get involved if you're interested. This project is something that we've turned into a citizen science project. Some of the sites are completely run by volunteers, and we have park interpretive associations, even school groups that in their local forests have taken ownership of putting in plots and following these protocols to submit data to the project. We're really fascinated to see if we can use sword fern as an indicator of where moisture overall is greatest in the redwood forest. This species in particular integrates fog and rainfall and temperature really well, and you can readily assess it from the size and shape of these plants. So in addition to having groups actually putting in their own plots, it's possible to just go around with your smartphone and take observations of where you're finding these species. Now, any of you that are working on plants like this, working on understory species, Chris showed you the distribution of oxalis. We really don't know the full species distribution for most of the plants that we're thinking about. And so having an opportunity to be able to help crowdsource where we're finding these species within watersheds can be really beneficial. The iNaturalist platform is really fun if you're a nerd when you're out hiking. You can take observations and submit them to a global database to help generate that sort of species distribution information. It uses the GPS tracker on your phone and your camera to take an observation of what you're seeing, and you can submit it. You can do that with anything that you're finding when you're outside. It's a really fun thing to create your own species list of what you're finding in places where you work. I've used my own collection, virtual collections to help me figure out where to establish new field sites. We've also created a Fern Watch specific project on the iNaturalist platform, meaning if you're taking an observation of a fern and you add it to our Fern Watch project, it'll take you through a series of fields where you can give us some more information, such as, are you seeing fiddleheads when you're looking at Plista communitum? Is the frond reproductive? We're really interested in learning more about the reproductive ecology of the species. And then I'm happy to give you a fancy high-tech tape measure if you want to measure the length of the fronds. So we're hoping to create much larger distribution models with the size information so that we can be tracking the viability of the species over the landscape. And really hope you'd like to join and be a part of it. And I've got handouts that explain how you do these measurements. Happy to send you a protocol. And be really fun to have us all working on this project collaboratively. So I think there's time for a couple of questions, and happy to answer them. I did forget to say that you've been a really good company as volunteers. I almost forgot to get to my best slide. So. I like to think that they were really interested in the sword fern when they were filming this movie.
The individuals that you were looking at in each location,
Mm-hmm.
are they relatively close to each other in the same area, or are they distributed throughout each park?
Yeah, great question. So the distribution of the plots at each site, these plots are generally clumped fairly closely together, and that's one of the limitations of the study, and that's why we think it would be really helpful, even just hiking along trails, to start getting that data more broadly in watersheds. The selection protocol was really going into those fern glades where we have a strong footprint of sword fern, but it could be that the most interesting results would be in those places where you're getting those stragglers of individuals up in a watershed further away from the riparian areas. It's harder to do this kind of study on steep slopes, and that's been one of the limitations of the project, but I think we might be finding more dramatic declines in the leaf area if we get further away from the places that these sites were established. Yeah.
I would imagine sunlight would have a big impact on the results.
Right. Yeah. The other aspects of the abiotic environment that could be affecting the overall population structure, total leaf area, we haven't yet quantified that. It's something we'd like to go back and do in all of our sites. We have about 130 plots that are distributed, so I know that's part of the noise in the data that we're seeing, but we need to characterize that.